Stephen's seductive invitation to expand her horizons leaves her questioning everything. Will Joan's desires destroy her, or will she embrace the dangerous path ahead? Prepare for a story of lust, betrayal, and complex emotions that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Joan felt the first stirrings of guilt as she walked beside Stephen, holding his hand timidly. They were heading toward the stairs that would take them down to where their spouses were waiting. Both had left their partners behind about an hour earlier, each not expecting the night to take the turns it had. As they reached the main floor, which served as a gathering area in the club they had entered, Joan fell quiet. She fought back tears when she spotted her husband sitting just 20 feet away. Seeing him smile warmly at her the moment their eyes met only deepened her guilt. The shame of what she had done hit her hard, knowing full well that she had enjoyed it more than she could admit. All she wanted was to run, but instead she stood frozen, silently hoping her husband would one day forgive her. Brent, her husband, felt a sense of pride and joy when he saw Joan step away from the stairs. The events of the night replayed in his mind, a mixture of disbelief and amazement. He had always harbored a fantasy, one he never expected to witness firsthand. Despite everything that had happened, Brent couldn't help but feel the intensity of what they had just experienced. However, as he looked at Joan, he could sense her internal struggle. She was battling with the weight of what she had done, and though Brent had enjoyed the night's unexpected turn of events, he knew that Joan wasn't feeling the same. Brent realized that while the night had been exhilarating for him, it had left Joan conflicted. He had long fantasized about the idea of sharing this experience, but now, seeing her distress, he understood that things wouldn't be as simple going forward. There was a momentary thrill in what had transpired, but he could sense that for Joan, the night had opened a door that she might not want to walk through again. With that in mind, he knew that if anything like this were to ever happen again, it would take time, understanding, and most importantly, trust. Taking a deep breath, he quickly approached her and said gently, "Hey, don't feel bad. Please don't. I know what happened, and I want you to know that it was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. You looked wonderful, and I hope you enjoyed it. I love you very much." When Joan heard her husband's words, she couldn't hold back her emotions anymore. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned into Brent's chest. Even while he held her close, she felt a heavy sense of guilt about what had happened. But as she began to take in his words and savor the warmth of his embrace, she slowly started to feel a bit of relief. Trying to keep her emotions in check so she wouldn't cry more in front of the many people around them, she asked softly, "How did you know?" "There's a hidden camera in the room you were in. Stacy told me that only a few people know about them. They're there for safety in case things get out of hand," Brent explained, smiling at Joan, his heart racing as he remembered what he had seen. "After Stacy left the room with you, she told me there was a chance we could find out what was happening. We went to the room with the monitors and she flipped through some channels until we found you. When I saw you two on that screen, I was so shocked. I could hardly believe my eyes." Joan blushed, feeling embarrassed about being seen in such a private moment. "What did you see?" she asked. "When the screen showed your room, I saw you on a desk and you weren't wearing anything at all. That surprised me so much. Stephen was also. Well, he wasn't dressed either and you both seemed very close. Then he leaned in toward you and you didn't seem to push him away. I was taken aback." Brent's face turned red as those images replayed in his mind. Feeling the weight of her upbringing, Joan felt a wave of guilt wash over her again. "I know you say it's okay, but I really feel bad right now." After a short pause, not liking how she felt inside, she continued, "I made a mistake, and I feel terrible about it." Suddenly remembering something from earlier that evening, she thought she had seen something in Brent that seemed to encourage her to be closer to Stephen. Realizing this was true made her feel frustrated. She started to ask, "What were you doing when?" But she stopped herself, knowing that asking Brent if he had done anything would sound very hypocritical, especially if she sounded angry. Still, with everything that had happened, she couldn't help but wonder if he truly loved and respected her, especially since she could see how excited he was about what had just happened. Feeling a swirl of emotions, she said to him, "Brent, please take me home. I want to go back to our hotel." For the next few minutes, Brent and Joan exchanged awkward goodbyes with Stephen and Stacy before getting into a cab that took them back to the club where their car was parked. They returned to their hotel in silence. It took almost a month for the guilt and anger Joan felt that night to fade away. Two things helped: time and honest talks with her husband. In the end, she happily accepted that Brent still loved and respected her just as he had before that night in Vegas. Through their conversations, she realized that his strong love for her meant seeing her happy, even if it was with someone else, brought him joy. She also understood that he felt delighted watching her finally break free from the limits that had held her back since childhood. One day, while driving home from work, Joan felt a wave of emotion wash over her. It was as if she were starting fresh. For the first time, she accepted that the desires she had kept hidden for so long were normal. This realization made it easier to accept that her feelings were simply part of being human. With this acceptance, Joan found her feelings for her husband, Brent, growing stronger. The closeness that had slipped away during their recent vacation in Las Vegas began to return. After being intimate with Brent several times in just a few days, she recalled something her friends Stephen and Stacy had said. They often had fun with others, but always reunited in a special way afterward. Joan realized that she and Brent were experiencing something similar now. As the days went on, her thoughts increasingly turned to Stephen. Joan felt grateful that Stephen was the second man she had ever been with. He had always treated her gently. During quiet moments, she found herself thinking about him and reminiscing about their time together. These memories turned into daydreams filled with a desire to see him again. Brent was excited when Joan opened up about her thoughts of Stephen and Stacy. He loved the look on her face when they were together, especially when he spoke playfully about her past experiences. This new energy encouraged him to make a significant phone call. He hesitated at first, but he knew it could change their lives. "Hi, can I speak with Stephen?" he asked when he got through. After a brief hold, he heard Stephen's voice. "Hello, this is Stephen." Brent felt a mix of nerves and excitement. "Hey, Stephen, this is Brent Evans. I'm not sure if you remember us, but my wife and I met you a little over a month ago in Las Vegas." Before Brent could continue, Stephen laughed and said, "Of course I remember you. Stacy and I have talked about you two quite a bit in recent weeks. We were starting to think we would never hear from you two again. This is a very nice surprise." As he spoke, Stephen felt a rush of excitement. Standing up to close the door to his office, all he could think about was Joan. He remembered how innocent and beautiful she was, and how wonderful their time together had felt. He simply couldn't get her out of his mind. Well, I'll be honest. Joan had a tough time for a while after everything that happened that night. She grew up in a strict household, and what she did took her some time to understand. But over time, she now knows it wasn't a bad thing. In fact, our relationship has been really great lately. After a brief pause, feeling a bit nervous, he continued. "Anyway, over the last week, Joan has been talking more about the two of you, especially about you. Because of that, I was wondering if you and Stacy might want to meet up with us again in Vegas sometime." "Absolutely. We would love that," Stephen replied quickly, trying to control his excitement. "I'm happy to hear that Joan has nice memories from that night. I have some wonderful memories from that time, too." After a moment, he added, "Stacy would be upset if I didn't mention that she has good memories about you as well." Taking a deep breath, Brent started to think back on the fun he had shared with Stephen's wife that night. He was still surprised by how much he had enjoyed their time together. However, he felt strange talking with someone who knew about that experience. "I'll be honest, I feel kind of odd about that. I hope everything is okay." Understanding Brent's discomfort, having experienced it with others before, Stephen replied, "Brent, don't even worry about it. We're open-minded people, remember? She spoke highly of you, and I know she would be happy to see you again." "Well, I would love to see her again too. But I think Joan would really love to see you again even more. Whenever we talk about that night, she gets a special look in her eye. I'm convinced she would like to have that kind of experience again. But I also think she'll probably need a little encouragement before anything happens. I'm thinking—" Brent paused for a moment, hardly believing what he was going to say next. "What if you called her out of the blue? It might spark a memory and encourage her to consider going back to Vegas sooner rather than later. When Stephen heard this, excitement spread through him. After making sure the office door was locked, he curiously asked, "Do you really think she would be open to a surprise call from me?" "Definitely. Well, I'd say there's a 95% chance. I have a business dinner tonight and she should be home alone. Are you interested in calling her tonight?" Brent asked, feeling a bit nervous. "Absolutely," Stephen replied, eager to call her right away. He thought for a moment and asked, "Should I say I got your number from you?" "No. Well, maybe. Just tell her I called you to say thanks and check in. Would that work?" "Yes, that sounds good." Stephen quickly wrote down Brent and Joan's home phone number. Confirming it, he felt the need to check with Brent again. "I want to make sure you're okay with this. I sense that if I call her, it might open up some strong feelings for her. Are you sure you want to go ahead?" Brent considered it for a moment and replied, "I think those feelings are already there." Taking a breath, Stephen said, "All right, I'm looking forward to calling her tonight." After hanging up, Stephen rose from his chair and checked the office door one last time to ensure it was locked. Satisfied, he sat back down at his desk and let his imagination wander to memories of Joan, feeling a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation about seeing her again. Stephen waited until it was 18 minutes past 7 to call Joan in Brent's house, hoping to make it seem spontaneous. As the phone rang, he noticed his palms were sweaty with anxiety at the thought of hearing Joan's voice again. After the 6th ring, he felt a thrill when he heard her familiar voice say, "Hello?" "Hello! This is an old friend from not too long ago. This is Stephen. Is this Joan?" he asked, shifting the phone to his other hand to wipe his sweaty palm on his pants. When Joan realized who it was, she felt a rush of surprise and excitement. Her heart raced as she stammered, "Hi," she said, a bit nervous. How are you doing?" She was worried about how Stephen got her phone number. "I'm doing well. Brent called me at work today to say hello. I think Stacy gave him one of my business cards when we all met. It was nice to hear from you both. Brent mentioned that things have been good for you two since then." He paused for a moment and added, "Stacy and I have talked about you two a lot, and we were concerned when we didn't hear from you. We hoped that night wasn't a bad experience for you. Everything is really okay, right?" Joan smiled, just like she had weeks ago. She appreciated that Stephen cared about her feelings. Moving to the couch, she said, I've been doing okay?" After a moment of thought, she continued, "But I have to confess, I feel bad about not saying goodbye properly. I kind of rushed Brent to take me home quickly that night because I felt really guilty about everything." "I'm sorry, I really hope things are better now," Stephen replied. Feeling a bit shy, Joan responded, "Oh, they really are." She sat down and tucked her feet under her, saying, "Being with you was a big step for me. You're the only other man I've been close to, and I'm married, so it was a lot to handle at the time." Stephen looked concerned and asked, "I really hope things are better for you now. No more feelings of guilt or anything like that?" "No, I'm good now." Joan paused and, nervously biting her lip, added, "It took some time, but I realized that Brent loves me just as much as before. In fact, he was understanding about what happened, which surprised me." After a deep breath, feeling comfortable with Stephen, she continued, "I've also come to accept that what happened between us was just a moment. It wasn't anything deeper, but it took me a while to accept that I had shared something special with someone other than my husband. I grew up thinking that closeness was only for married couples and for starting a family. It's not something you do just for fun, especially with someone you hardly know." Despite this, Stephen asked carefully, "Well, I hope you're okay with everything now. Brent mentioned you were, but I just wanted to confirm." Smiling at his genuine concern, Joan replied simply, "It is true." "Great." After a moment, Stephen added, "And I hope you have only good memories of that night we shared. I know I do. I will always remember it." With a shy grin, Joan said, "I do. I will." Stephen's expression turned more serious as he asked, "So, is there anything specific you remember most fondly about that night?" Joan hesitated for a moment, feeling a rush of emotions. Looking around to ensure they were alone, she replied softly, "I'm not sure. A lot happened that night." Encouraging her playfully, Stephen pressed, "Come on, there has to be something special that stands out. What is it?" After some thought, Joan answered, "Well, when you brushed against my leg at the club, that was really thrilling." Surprised, Stephen replied, "Really? I thought that was pretty simple. I enjoyed teasing you in that moment, but I didn't think it would be your highlight." "Well, it wasn't the only thing. It's that you did it while I was sitting next to Brent. That made it feel both risky and exciting." As she spoke, she lightly traced her fingers along her leg, remembering the moment. Stephen smiled, recalling Joan's reaction that night. "It was fun. Totally unexpected for me, too. Your stories pulled me in." After a pause, he asked, "But there's gotta be something else that stood out for you, is there?" Thinking hard, Joan couldn't come up with anything else, finally admitting, "I'm sorry. There's really nothing else because everything felt almost dreamlike. From when we first met to when you kissed me after. Well, after you expressed how you felt, it all stands out." Stephen sighed, recalling what she was hinting at, remembering how intense everything had felt. After a breath, he had asked if he could kiss her, surprised when she not only agreed, but expressed her desire to be close again during that moment. Smiling, he remembered how wonderful it felt to be close to her again. He thought about the long, tender kisses they shared that night. Still wanting to express himself, he said, "You're right. I remember it all clearly, too." He took a deep breath and continued, "But I need to be honest, if that's okay. I can't remember if I mentioned it then, and I'm sorry if I didn't, but I really want you to know that you have a sweetness about you." As she took this in, Joan sighed. Biting her lower lip, she closed her eyes and thought of his bright blue eyes looking up at her. Remembering those moments made her feel a mix of emotions that she found hard to ignore. Feeling a bit embarrassed that she was thinking about such things, she said, "You're being a bit naughty. You should stop. You're making me blush." Stephen quickly responded, "Do you want me to stop?" Feeling a little shaky about how to reply, Joan eventually said quietly, "No." Then she remembered something and felt a bit frustrated. "But I can't talk much longer. My mom is coming to stay with Brent and me for a few days. She was supposed to come tomorrow but changed her plans and will be here any minute." Disappointed but understanding, Stephen said, "Oh no, I was looking forward to talking with you tonight, but I get it. I'm sorry, I want to talk with you too." After a moment, Joan added, "Can we chat again in a few days?" Seizing the chance, Stephen said, "Absolutely. I have an even better idea. What if you and Brent come to Vegas? It would be great to spend time with both of you again. I would love to see you." Taking a nervous breath as Joan shifted her position, she felt a rush of excitement. Enjoying the feeling, she realized she still needed to answer Stephen's invite. Though she was feeling a bit unsure, she replied, "I don't know. I would have to ask Brent." Teasing her, Stephen asked, "Okay, but what do you think? Would you like to come here?" Joan felt uneasy as she heard Stephen's suggestion. She hesitated, her emotions a mix of nervousness and uncertainty. Finally, she managed to say, "Maybe. I don't know. I'll think about it." Stephen laughed softly and replied, "I'm hearing a yes in there somewhere." He continued confidently, "Good. That's what I like to hear." Walking around to shake off his own restlessness, he added, "Whatever happens, just promise me you'll talk to Brent about it. There are some fun events at that club if you decide to go back. I really think it would be a great time if we all went together again." He paused dramatically, then added, "Maybe it could be a chance for you to try something new, something even more exciting." Joan felt a rush of emotions, her face growing warm. With her heart racing, she asked nervously, "What do you mean?" Stephen teased her, "I'll tell you more if you come with us, or better yet, show you." Just then, the doorbell rang, and Joan sighed in frustration. "Oh no, my mom's here." Stephen responded quickly, "All right, I'll let you go. But one last thing, I hope you and Brent come out soon. Really soon." Pausing again, he added, "And more than anything, I hope I get to see you again, Joan. I've been thinking about it a lot." Joan felt her breath catch in her throat. She couldn't find the words to respond, feeling both flustered and embarrassed by his boldness. Stephen smiled, sensing how his words affected her. "Bye, Joan. I'm really looking forward to it. Hopefully it's sooner rather than later." After hanging up, Stephen stretched and felt satisfied with their conversation, hopeful that Joan would agree to meet again. With his thoughts still lingering on the call, he made his way through his house and down to the basement, where his wife was sitting on the couch watching a movie. Smiling to himself, he sat beside her, content with how his day had played out. Holding her closely, he embraced her as they shared a quiet, intimate moment. His wife, with a soft and shaky voice, said, "I guess you spoke with her, and there's a good chance she's considering coming." A few moments later, she added, "That's good, because I'd love to meet her again, and I hope her husband will be as excited about it as we are." For the next week, Joan couldn't stop thinking about Stephen and the idea of going back to the swingers club. What intrigued her most was Stephen's comment about expanding her horizons. The thought of what he might have meant stirred a mixture of nervousness and excitement in her. She couldn't help but imagine the possibilities, though they frightened her a little. Deep down, though, she was more excited than afraid. Without fully understanding why, Joan's curiosity eventually led her to ask Brent if he might want to go back to Las Vegas. She playfully suggested, "Maybe this weekend, if you're up for it?" Brent quickly agreed, perhaps a little too eagerly, replying, "Yeah, I'll book everything right now." Joan wasn't bothered by his enthusiasm, though. Despite a bit of anxiety about where this might lead, her mind had been filled with thoughts of what could happen, and that anticipation thrilled her. A part of her wished they could leave for Las Vegas that very night. The following 3 days felt like weeks, but finally, as they drove their rental car out of the hotel parking lot in Las Vegas, both Brent and Joan felt a surge of excitement and energy. They knew exactly where they were headed. Brent had already called Stephen earlier that week to make arrangements. Both men agreed to skip any formalities like dinner and go straight to the club. After the call, Brent briefly wondered if Joan would prefer a more traditional meeting. To his surprise, when he told her the plan, she expressed that meeting Stephen and his wife directly at the club was fine by her. From the look on her face, Brent knew Joan was just as eager to go back to the club as he was. That realization filled him with anticipation as the days slowly passed. 20 minutes after entering the club, both Brent and Joan were feeling the intensity of their excitement, each sensing the thrill of the moment ahead. Joan felt a lively energy when she saw Stephen smiling at her from across the crowded room. As he approached her from the bar, the excitement grew inside her until she thought she might burst. "Hey, you two! It's great to see you again!" Stephen shouted over the loud music which filled the space where people danced on the wooden floor. Brent smiled and shook Stephen's hand firmly. "It's good to see you too," he said. He noticed the joy on Stephen's face as he took in Joan again. Brent couldn't help but smile wider when Stephen's attention fully turned to his wife. "Joan, you look absolutely stunning," Stephen exclaimed after taking a moment to admire her. She did look beautiful. Joan wore a stylish white blouse that showed off her toned stomach, the shiny sapphire ring in her navel catching the light. She also had on a classy dark blue skirt that was just a bit short, and her sandals highlighted her lovely legs. Stephen was captivated by her charm, and it seemed like every man nearby appreciated her youthful beauty too. As Joan felt Stephen's gaze on her, she noticed the warmth in her cheeks. "Thanks," she replied, a little shy, then added, "You look good too." In a black shirt and khaki pants that suited his athletic build, Stephen smiled back, saying, "Thank you. Come join me at a table by the bar for a drink. Stacy ran off for a minute, but she'll be back soon." When Stephen gently placed his hand on her back to guide her, Joan felt a pleasant chill spread through her. A moment later, seated at the table, she heard Stephen ask, "Are you both feeling more at ease here now than a couple of weeks ago?" Brent laughed. "Yes, much more comfortable. There's not as much worry about what we're getting into this time." After thinking about it, he added, "Well, not as strong as before anyway." Stephen laughed and said, "Good." He turned to Joan and asked, "What about you?" Joan sat there, realizing she was back at a swingers club. Even with everything that happened the last time and her growing wish to return, she still found it hard to believe she was here again. When she heard Stephen's question, she shyly answered, "Yeah." After a moment, she added, "But I'm still pretty nervous." "Are you feeling excited nervousness or worried nervousness?" Stephen asked, concerned but also playfully. Just then, Joan spotted Stacy walking up to Brent, smiling as she playfully covered his eyes and said, "Guess who?" When Stacy leaned down to give Brent a kiss on the ear, Joan felt a sudden pang of jealousy. But as she watched Brent's face light up, She also found him more attractive as he tried to hide how much he enjoyed it. The unexpected feeling surprised her. Though Joan knew she and Brent had shared intimate moments, he had never shared details with her. Until tonight, she had appreciated that. Now, though, she felt drawn to know what they had done together. She also wondered if the look Brent had just shown was one he loved to see on her. Trying to push aside those thoughts and make up for any displeasure she might have shown earlier, Joan said to Stacy, "You look great tonight." Wearing a black outfit that highlighted her figure, Stacy beamed at the compliment. "Thank you. You're looking wonderful yourself." "I'm sure our friends would agree with that." Feeling a bit shy, Joan could only say, "Thanks." For the next 30 minutes, the two couples chatted casually about their lives. No one wanted to come across as too eager or desperate to get things going. As they enjoyed their drinks, Stephen began to focus more on Joan, while Brent did the same with Stacy. It was Stacy who finally added some excitement when she leaned close to Brent and whispered playfully, "Do you want to know what I was up to before you and your wife arrived?" With a grin, and making sure Joan was focused on Stephen, Brent replied, "Of course. A good friend of mine asked me to help her surprise her husband for his birthday." Intrigued, Brent asked, "And what did you do?" Smiling at his curiosity, Stacy said, "We teamed up to give him a special treat." Brent's mind raced and he asked, "And who got to finish it off, you or your friend?" With a mischievous smile, Stacy answered, "She did, in her own way." Brent, curious about what she meant, asked, "What do you mean, in her own way?" Enjoying the moment, Stacy leaned in closer and whispered, "She helped him relax and I had my share of the fun." Brent felt a rush of excitement and quickly glanced over to see if Joan and Stephen were listening. Relieved they weren't, he asked eagerly, "Did you enjoy that?" "Definitely, but I enjoyed it even more when she helped clean up afterward." Leaning back in his chair in disbelief, Brent felt a sudden wave of tension. He stretched a bit, then leaned closer to Stacy again, saying, "Don't take this the wrong way, but you can be so bold, and that really gets me going." Stacy smiled, pleased by his reaction. She wanted to keep the momentum going, so she said, "Well, maybe this will excite you even more. Stephen knows about my little adventure earlier, and I told him I hope to do something fun again tonight. This time, I hope to share some of that excitement with your wife." Brent felt his head spin at her words. Trembling at the thought, he took a few deep breaths to calm down. Once he felt a bit steadier, he turned to Stacy and said, "That would be..." He paused, searching for just the right word, and finally said, "Beautiful!" "You really do look lovely tonight, Joan. Stunning, actually. You have no idea how hard it is for me to hold back." Sighing heavily, feeling excited just being near Stephen, Joan felt a rush of nerves. The thrill from his voice made her feel even more awake. She bit her lip, unable to find the right words to respond. Noticing how easily Joan was reacting to him, Stephen continued to tease her. He asked, "Tell me, is there a part of you that wishes I would be bold? A part of you that wants everyone here to see how much you enjoy it?" Feeling her heart race and her skin tingle, Joan looked at Stephen with wide eyes, silently asking him to stop. But seeing his playful grin, she knew he was aware of the effect he had on her. She whispered, "Stop, please, you're being cheeky again." Stephen sensed he was walking a fine line. He knew he could push her too hard and cause her to pull away. So he decided to take a step back but not stop completely. "Okay, but can I ask you something?" Still feeling a bit shaky, hoping their friends couldn't see, she replied quietly, "Maybe." "Did you think about what we talked about on the phone?" Knowing exactly what he meant but wanting to play coy, Joan answered, "Which part?" Smiling, enjoying their playful exchange, Stephen replied, "The part about trying new things together?" Biting her lip again, she wrestled with whether to be honest with him. Finally, she said, "Yes." Feeling a rush of excitement, Stephen took a breath, unsure of how she might respond. "So what are some things you've thought about? What could we explore together? Can we explore new experiences together?" Feeling both excited and nervous about stepping into something unfamiliar, Joan honestly replied, "I don't know." Stephen wished Joan had a clearer answer so they could move forward, but part of him also enjoyed the thrill of the unknown. He smiled, happy to have an opportunity, and asked her, Would you like to go upstairs with me and see what we can find? Joan felt a mix of emotions, as if she might burst with anticipation. Biting her lip, she thought, should I really do this? Do I want to? Can I? Then she looked at Stephen and asked, if I go, will you be kind? Understanding she needed reassurance, Stephen quickly replied, I would never pressure you to do anything you're not comfortable with. Joan gave him a playful smile and said, that's what you said last time I was here, and things got a bit out of hand. Stephen grinned, knowing he had encouraged her but never forced her, and said confidently, you know what I mean? She did, and she was at peace with her choice. After thinking it over for a moment, she finally said, okay, I'll go, but I can't promise anything. Feeling a rush of excitement, Stephen simply replied, fair enough. As Stephen noticed Brent and Stacy chatting closely, he broke in when they paused, saying, hey, you two, would you mind if Joan and I stepped away for a bit to explore? That's fine with me, sweetie, Stacy replied before adding with a teasing tone, but what exactly are you exploring? Our lovely Joan here or the club? Stephen shot her a playful look and said, the club, sweetheart. Then he turned to Brent and asked, how about you, Brent? Would you mind if I whisk your wife away to show her some parts of the club she missed during your last visit? Brent couldn't hide his smile, excited at the thought of Joan spending time with another man. After almost 2 months of imagining it, he looked at her and said proudly, I have no objections, only if she's comfortable with it. Joan felt a flutter in her chest at hearing these words from her husband, and she gave him a shy smile. Brent could tell by her expression that Joan was eager to go, and it made him happy. Standing up, he reached for her hand and helped her to her feet. As he moved closer, the scent of her perfume filled the air, and he kissed her gently before whispering into her ear, let yourself enjoy this. Push your boundaries and do whatever feels right. Joan's eyes widened as she took in his words. She knew Brent was supportive, but his encouragement surprised her. She wondered what exactly he meant, feeling a bit unsure. Her thoughts were interrupted when he kissed her neck briefly, and she felt a rush of emotions. Life had certainly taken a new and exciting turn for them, but his words left her with more questions than answers. As she said goodbye, her response was more uncertain than confident. Okay? Feeling both anxious and excited, Brent watched as Joan followed Stephen up the spiral staircase to the second floor. When she was out of sight, he sat back down, giving Stacy a smile that made him look like someone caught doing something mischievous. Giggling at his expression, Stacy asked, do you want to go to the monitor room and check on them? Absolutely. All right, but can you do me a favor first? Brent, raising an eyebrow curiously, replied, sure, anything? Stacy grinned. The owner of this place has a private office nearby. There's a beautiful oak desk in there, and I've got this wild idea that we should go check it out together. Brent was momentarily taken aback by her bold suggestion. After taking a deep breath to steady himself, he nodded. Lead the way. Meanwhile, Stephen held Joan's hand as they walked down a softly lit hallway. He was buzzing with excitement at being alone with her again. As they moved through the winding corridor, Stephen glanced at the rooms they passed, looking for an empty one. Finally spotting one, he gently pulled Joan inside. Once they were in the room, Stephen, overcome with excitement, pressed Joan against the wall, his emotions surging as he leaned in to kiss her passionately. Joan gasped in surprise at Stephen's sudden move, but quickly relaxed, allowing herself to respond to his kiss. As they continued their kiss, Joan noticed how their breathing had become fast and shallow, and they both trembled as they held each other tightly. She responded to his intensity, kissing him back with just as much passion. A few moments later, she gasped when Stephen gently took her chin, tilting her head so he could trail soft kisses along her ear and neck, sending shivers down her spine. She felt her knees weaken when she heard him whisper, Joan, you don't know how much I want you right now. Before she could fully process what was happening, Joan found herself turned toward the wall, her hands resting against it. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of Stephen kneeling behind her. She shivered as she felt his hands sliding up the backs of her legs. A soft sigh escaped her as his hands gently moved beneath her blouse, making her feel vulnerable yet captivated. She drew in a breath as he moved her blouse, but quickly found herself overwhelmed by the moment. The intensity of the situation made her heart race, and she tried to steady herself, unsure of what to expect next. Stephen stood up, his hands resting on her hips as he leaned close, letting her feel the warmth between them. His closeness filled the room with a charged atmosphere, and the tension hung in the air. Stephen, his voice filled with emotion, whispered, "Joan, I want to be close to you right now." Joan felt the weight of his words and the intensity of the moment, unsure of what to say, but knowing the situation had brought them both to an unexpected crossroads. "I want to see you reach your limit," Joan gasped when she heard him say this. She turned slightly to glance at him and responded, "Then go ahead." Her emotions were swirling, and she turned back to face the wall, pressing herself against him with a sense of urgency. But just as she did, she realized that the door to the room was still open. Normally, Joan would have wanted privacy in such a moment, but now she found she didn't care. For the first time, a part of her even felt a strange thrill at the idea of being discovered. Feeling a shiver run through her, Joan noticed Stephen's hands gently moving along her back, tracing down her sides as he teasingly pressed closer to her. He could see how much she wanted him to act on his words, but despite the intensity of the moment, Stephen fought the impulse and stepped back. Slowly, he adjusted her blouse, covering her up again, and said, "Not yet. Let's explore the club for a while first. I want to show you something new, something you haven't experienced before." Joan, still caught up in the moment, responded with a playful frustration. "You're so mean!" Stephen laughed softly, understanding she didn't truly mean it. "I know," he said, "but trust me, I don't think you'll feel that way for long." He paused, then added, "No matter what happens tonight, I promise you'll feel something special before it's over." Joan smiled, both shy and curious about what lay ahead. As she took a deep breath to steady herself, still feeling the intensity of their brief moment, she realized her panties were still tangled around her ankles. As she reached down to pull them back up, Stephen stopped her. "No, leave them," he said. "You can have them back when you're ready to go home." Joan, someone who always wore her underwear, felt a mischievous thrill as she lifted her feet one by one, letting Stephen take the garment away. "You know, your presence alone could make anyone lose their composure," Stephen said with a smile as he stood up. Then he asked, "Are you ready to go?" Still feeling a bit unsettled, Joan replied simply, "Yes." She tugged at her blouse, trying to pull it down as far as possible, then took Stephen's hand again, following him out of the room. As they walked down the hallway, Joan felt an unexpected thrill as the cool air brushed against her legs. About 30 minutes later, Joan found herself feeling a strong sense of anticipation again. Stephen's fingers lightly tracing her neck as they stood together heightened her awareness. They were peering through a glass wall into an area of the club known as the main room. To her right, Joan's attention was captured by a couple in an intimate moment. The woman was lying comfortably on her back, her knees bent, while the man leaned over her. As they shared this private connection, Joan couldn't help but notice the peaceful expressions on their faces. Her gaze drifted to another scene on the left. Even though she had seen something similar on a previous visit, she watched closely as people in the room seemed completely in tune with each other, sharing in the same sense of closeness. Joan's heartbeat quickened, her attention shifting back and forth between the different interactions taking place. It wasn't long before her pulse raced at the heightened energy around her. Stephen, standing behind Joan, noticed how deeply she was affected by the atmosphere of the room. He was also aware of a group of people nearby, many of whom seemed just as fascinated by Joan as they were by the room itself. Smiling, Stephen leaned in and softly said, "Isn't it amazing to see people connecting like this, everyone enjoying themselves?" Joan, feeling a light shiver as Stephen's hands gently brushed along her sides, responded, "Yes." Stephen, noticing how much this environment was affecting her, said with a knowing smile, "It had the same effect on you the last time you were here, didn't it? Tell me honestly, do you ever wish you were one of those women in there right now?" Joan was still watching the woman, who was completely focused on the man she was with. Seeing her so caught up in the moment made it tough for Joan to answer Stephen's question. She felt a pang of jealousy for the woman, but at the same time, she couldn't believe she was wanting something so forbidden. As she thought more clearly, she realized that these feelings had been growing inside her for weeks now. Still, because of how she had been raised, she started to push those thoughts away for the first time tonight. Even though she didn't truly want to, Joan stepped back from the glass and said, "Let's go somewhere else." Stephen, after talking with Brent, was worried he might see Joan struggle that night, but he hoped it wouldn't happen. He reminded himself to be patient. Looking back at her, he said, "Okay." He reached down to take her hand, and together they walked down the hallway. Stephen sensed that Joan was on the edge of a big change in her life, but he also knew she might want to go back downstairs and leave the club. He decided he had to encourage her but needed to be careful. Now was not the time for any risky conversation, so he simply asked, "Are you okay?" "Yeah," she replied. "Good." He paused for a moment, then asked, "Is there anything else you think you would like to see or do right now? Or do you want to take a break?" Joan appreciated that Stephen was taking things slow for her. She smiled and said, "No, I'm fine." After thinking for a moment, she added, "What do you think we should do?" She could feel a sense of excitement starting to build again, and she liked it. Seeing Joan's curious look return made Stephen happy. He was surprised it came back so quickly, but was thrilled nonetheless. "Well, there are 2 other areas we didn't visit last time you were here. Would you like to see them?" Feeling more excited about the unknown, Joan shyly asked, "What are they?" "One is a room for role play, and the other is a space for women who want to connect with other women." Joan quickly responded, "I think I can pass on the first one." "I'm not really interested in that kind of thing," Joan said. "That's fine. It's not for everyone," Stephen replied. Still curious, he asked, "What about the women's area? Would you want to see that?" "I definitely would." Joan smiled and teased, "Oh, so you like seeing 2 women together, huh?" "Of course." Stephen laughed. "I think many guys do. It's exciting. Doesn't Brent enjoy watching that too?" Joan giggled and said, "Yeah, he does." Feeling a little bold, Stephen asked, "What about you? Have you ever thought about being close with another woman?" Joan felt a flutter in her stomach. She replied honestly, "I've thought about it, but usually I don't think I could actually do it." After a moment, she added, "I think women's bodies are beautiful, but I'm not sure I'd want to act on it." Then she asked, "Has Stacy ever been with another woman?" With a smile, Stephen answered, "Oh yes, several times." "Did she like it?" Joan asked, unsure if it was a strange question. "Not just liked it, she loves it. She's even said that no one does it better than another woman." Joan felt even more curious and asked, "Have you ever seen her with someone?" "Absolutely, several times. It drives me wild," Stephen said, his mind racing with memories of Stacy. "By the way, she told me she's interested in you. She's brought it up more than once." Joan felt a mix of surprise and embarrassment. Finally, she said, "I'm flattered. I think—" After a brief silence, trying not to push her, Stephen asked, "So what do you think? Should we check it out?" Joan hesitated. Part of her was tempted to explore the place Stephen mentioned, but a bigger part of her was thinking differently. "Maybe we can do that another time. Right now, I'd rather see men and women together. Take me somewhere fun." Stephen felt a rush of excitement and warmth. Seeing Joan's animated expression made him happy. He decided he would take her to the place he had in mind since the beginning of the night. Excited, he said, "I know just the right place." He kept it a secret and took hold of Joan's hand again, leading her down another hallway. They both felt a growing excitement with every step. A few minutes later, Joan started to wonder where Stephen was taking her when they reached a big man standing at the entrance of another hallway. As Joan looked up at the man, who was much taller and heavier than she was, she thought he looked like someone from a motorcycle club. She felt slightly more at ease when the man smiled and said to Stephen, "Hey, buddy, long time no see." Stephen tapped the man on the arm, which looked very strong, and said, "Hey, Big E, I haven't been up here in a few weeks. How are the kids?" Big E grinned. "Eating everything in the house. It's giving me gray hairs." He then looked at Joan, checking her out as he added with a laugh, "Does Stacy know you're here?" Smiling, knowing his friend likely already guessed the answer, Stephen replied proudly, "Yep." Looking at Joan with admiration, Big E said to Stephen, "You're a lucky guy." After a moment he asked, "Does the boss know you're here?" No, but do you think he'd mind? Stephen's comment was clearly about Joan. Not at all, Big E said before chatting with Stephen for a little longer. He then stepped aside and said, Enjoy yourselves. We will. Still holding Joan's hand, Stephen began to walk down the hallway. After turning a corner once they were out of earshot, he said to her, Big E's real name is Ernie, but nobody dares to call him that. He looks tough, but he's actually really nice. Why is he standing there? Joan asked, curious. Stephen stopped and looked her in the eye. Listen, the place I'm taking you is very special. The only people who know about it are the owner and a few select guests, maybe 50 or 60 people at most. Since this club is in Vegas, many tourists come by, which is why it's so private. Keeping this place secret is important because some guests are important members of the community. So you have to promise me that whatever you see or hear, you won't tell anyone. Ever. Joan listened closely, captivated and flattered that Stephen was showing her such a special place. Before Joan could respond, Stephen continued, There's something else you should know before we go any further. The atmosphere here is a little more relaxed, and people tend to be more bold and forward. But don't worry, they'll know it's your first time because they'll either recognize you're new or hear about it, especially because of how beautiful you are. There are a lot of attractive regulars, but trust me, they would definitely remember you. He paused, concerned she might hesitate, and added, I just wanted to make sure you're aware of this before we continue. Joan felt even more intrigued than before. Despite a flicker of nervousness and caution, her curiosity had grown stronger. Thoughts swirled in her mind, making her question whether she should proceed, but those very emotions fueled her excitement. Feeling almost captivated by the moment, she replied, I promise I won't say no. Eager, she added, You've really got me curious now, so let's go. Stephen, clearly pleased, smiled and said, All right. Teasing her a bit, he added as they began walking, I have a feeling that where we're headed might be the place where you get the chance to try something completely new. I also think this will be a night you'll never forget. Hearing this, Joan felt another rush of excitement. She became more aware of her own sense of adventure, knowing she was about to step into something unfamiliar, yet thrilling. As they continued walking, Joan realized she was ready to embrace this experience, leaving behind the reserved person she was raised to be. As they passed through long strands of beads that formed a curtain-like doorway, Joan's eyes took a moment to adjust to the dimly lit room. Once her vision cleared, her attention was drawn to a petite blonde woman in the center of the room. What struck Joan wasn't the fact that the woman was undressed, but rather her confidence and the boldness of her actions. Joan's curiosity piqued as she observed the scene, her mind spinning with new thoughts about the unexpected things this night might hold. Joan held on to Stephen's hand tightly, captivated by the scene unfolding just a few feet in front of her. It took her a moment to realize that many other couples were also sharing intimate moments throughout the room, each absorbed in their own experience. Stephen gently led her toward a large black leather couch nearby. As they sat down, Joan took in the activity around her, the soft hum of music blending with the occasional sound of whispered conversations and quiet expressions of joy. Her eyes traveled across the room, and she soon found herself watching two couples on a matching couch across from them. Joan bit her lip without thinking as she observed the scene unfolding. Two women were embracing, exchanging gentle kisses, their connection clear. Both were kneeling as they enjoyed each other's company, while their partners were close by, watching and partaking in the experience in their own way. As Joan watched, one of the women shifted, lying on her back, reaching out for her partner with a smile. The two continued their shared moment of closeness, and Joan felt a mix of emotions as she quietly observed. The atmosphere in the room was one of openness and shared connection, each person seemingly lost in their own world of enjoyment. Movement to Joan's left drew her attention again. The petite blonde woman from earlier was now in a different position, held gently by her partner, who seemed to effortlessly keep her balanced. The energy in the room was palpable, yet Joan remained quiet, taking it all in, unsure how to feel but captivated by the unique atmosphere surrounding her. As Joan watched, she could hear the petite blonde woman laughing and gasping, clearly reacting to the playful situation she was in. The sounds of her enjoyment mixed with occasional sharp breaths as the man continued to focus on her, adding to the atmosphere. The woman reached out, attempting to reciprocate, her hands just managing to grasp the man's hand before she returned her attention to him. Joan became completely absorbed in the scene, losing track of time. Her heart raced, and her face grew warm as she watched. Suddenly, she gasped out loud when she felt a light pinch on her right side. Startled, Joan looked at Stephen, feeling a rush of emotions as she saw the intensity in his gaze. A moment later, she heard him whisper, "Soon, you and I will be doing exactly what everyone else here is doing." His words sent a wave of excitement through her, making her pulse quicken. A part of her longed for what he described, but another part felt a growing sense of unease. As much as Joan was drawn to the idea of being close to him, the public setting made her nervous. She couldn't tell if Stephen intended for something to happen right here or in a more private space, and that uncertainty filled her with a mix of anticipation and caution. Moments passed, and Joan's nerves began to shift toward fear. She sat frozen, unsure of what to do as Stephen reached for the knot holding her shirt in place. Her mind raced as she realized what it would mean if the knot came undone, exposing her in front of everyone. Finally snapping out of her trance, she moved to stop him, bringing her hands to his. But when she heard him quietly plead, "Don't stop me. I want to see you, and I want everyone here to see you," Joan hesitated, feeling torn between resisting and surrendering to the moment. Stephen, sensing the conflicting emotions on Joan's face, was encouraged by her hesitation. He believed she might let herself step outside her comfort zone if he pushed gently enough. Fueled by his excitement, he worked carefully on the knot, saying softly, "Look around you, sweetie. Every man in this room has been looking at you. They want to see you. They want to see how beautiful you are, just like everyone else here," Stephen said with a smile, noticing Joan's eyes darting around the room. She was finally realizing something that had been there all along, and Stephen confirmed her thoughts. "That's right. Every woman here is without anything on. They're all completely uncovered except you." Joan took a deep breath, surprised that she hadn't noticed this sooner. As she glanced around the room, she caught the eyes of several men watching her. A chill ran down her spine as she understood what they were thinking. She could sense their curiosity and attention. Her mind screamed for her to leave, but at the same time she realized she wasn't going anywhere. In fact, the more she thought about it, the more she found herself intrigued by the attention. The idea that strangers were so curious to see her sparked a new feeling inside her, one that made her bite her lower lip as excitement coursed through her. Stephen noticed her reaction and felt a surge of excitement himself. In a moment, he untied the knot of her shirt. Slowly, he pulled the fabric aside, revealing Joan's chest to the room. Joan felt the cool air against her skin, and for the first time she felt truly exposed. The sight of some of the men staring at her made her heart race, and she could almost feel their interest. But before she could dwell on it, Stephen leaned forward, his lips gently brushing against her skin. She let out a soft sigh, feeling the warmth of his touch. As he continued, she felt a mix of new sensations that made her shiver. Stephen, hearing Joan's quiet sounds, continued for a few minutes, alternating his attention. When he felt her fingers gently running through his hair, he knew she was encouraging him to continue. But instead, he pulled back slightly, his eyes gleaming as he teasingly said, "You know what? I think it's time to take off your skirt." Stephen leaned in and whispered, "I'm going to make you feel good right here in front of everyone." He adjusted his position, adding, "And while I do, I want you to look around and see the way people are watching you, how they react." Joan trembled at his words, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. She couldn't respond, only breathing deeper as the tension between excitement and nervousness built inside her. Her body shook even more when she felt Stephen's hands on her hips, his fingers gently gripping the waistband of her skirt. A second later, she instinctively wanted to stop him, but something held her back. As he began to slowly lower her skirt, Joan was surprised by how she subtly lifted her hips to help him. His fingertips glided down her legs as he removed her skirt and sandals, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. Stephen took in the sight of Joan sitting there, knowing the situation must be captivating for those watching. He savored the moment, running his hands lightly up and down her legs, letting his fingertips trace her skin. His gaze locked with hers, noticing the mixture of emotions on her face, anticipation, and uncertainty. He gently placed his hands on her knees and with a steady look began to part them. He pulled her closer, stopping when she was at the edge of the couch. Both trembling, Stephen leaned in slowly, his eyes still on hers, savoring the intensity of the moment. Joan took a deep breath, her body reacting as the room around her seemed to disappear. The sounds of the room faded into the background as the experience consumed her, and for a moment, everything else was forgotten. Within seconds, Joan found herself gripping the leather couch tightly, trying to steady herself against the intense feelings running through her. She barely registered how firmly Stephen held her in place, ensuring she stayed grounded in the moment. Stephen, thrilled by her reactions, continued to move with care and precision, adjusting his rhythm to bring her as much comfort and pleasure as possible. He focused on her responses, occasionally letting out a quiet sound himself, encouraged by the connection they shared. His attention never wavered as he kept things steady, letting Joan get lost in the experience. Joan, in a haze of sensations, closed her eyes, moving gently with the rhythm. After a moment, she remembered something Stephen had said earlier. She opened her eyes again, glancing around the room to take in her surroundings. Her gaze landed on a man nearby, who was sitting only a few feet away, watching her intently. Startled, Joan felt a mix of surprise and curiosity. The man, appearing to be in his 40s, met her gaze, his expression calm and aware. His presence brought a new layer of complexity to Joan's emotions, and she found herself unsure of how to react. Her focus shifted between the situation unfolding around her and her own growing awareness of the room, but she remained grounded, reflecting on the moment with a quiet intensity, still held by the connection Stephen had created. Joan's pulse raced as she glanced at the stranger nearby. She noticed him increasing his focus on her as his attention shifted away from her eyes to her body. The intensity of the moment grew as he observed Stephen's movements. Unconsciously, Joan began to move in rhythm, her body responding to the growing sensations. As the moment built, Joan's breathing quickened. She could feel everything heightening, the sensation of Stephen's careful touch and the knowledge that the stranger was watching, his attention on her every move. With each passing second, the intensity surged, and Joan took in a deep breath, preparing for the wave of emotion that was about to overwhelm her. A moment later, she cried out, her body arching as the sensation overtook her. She pressed herself into the couch, her muscles tensing as her body reacted to the rush of feelings. Gripping Stephen's head, she instinctively pulled him closer, seeking to extend the moment as long as possible, her vision blurring as the intensity peaked. Stephen, aware of Joan's reaction, smiled as he continued to gently provide comfort. Her body trembled, and he could sense how strong the emotions running through her were. His focus remained on ensuring she felt supported throughout, pleased that he had helped create such a powerful moment for her. In the background, Stephen felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing how deeply Joan had connected with the moment. He also understood that those around them were observing, likely wishing they could share in the experience. But for now, his attention was fully on Joan, ensuring she felt completely at ease. As Joan's intensity began to fade, she placed a hand on Stephen's forehead, signaling she needed a pause. Understanding her body language, Stephen gently slowed down, letting the moment settle naturally. Stephen smiled as he spoke confidently. She can do whatever she wants to. His posture shifted slightly as he spoke, adding to his bold statement. Joan felt a mix of emotions, flattered by Eric's interest, but also frozen in the moment. She could sense how much Eric wanted her attention, but her body didn't respond right away. Stephen, noticing her hesitation and the conflict on her face, decided to take the lead. Without asking, he turned to Eric and said, "Come closer." Joan's thoughts raced as Eric moved toward her. A voice in her head told her to say something, to stop what was happening, but she remained silent. She had only imagined being close to Stephen in this way. But now, as Eric approached, her feelings shifted. When she felt the warmth of his body near hers, she realized she was curious and open to this new experience. For a few tense moments, Joan still didn't move, her heart racing. The intensity of her emotions grew, especially when Stephen gently guided her hand to rest on Eric's body. Eric let out a quiet sigh as Joan's hand touched him. That simple reaction gave Joan a surge of confidence. Encouraged by his response, she began to explore, running her hands slowly along his body. She took her time, feeling every inch of his presence, letting her curiosity guide her movements. As Joan's confidence grew, so did her curiosity. She adjusted her grip, and with more steady movements, she felt the weight of what she was doing sink in, surprised by her own actions. Stephen, still seated beside her, watched her face closely. He could see how her initial nervousness had been replaced by interest and wonder. As Joan continued to explore, Stephen gently ran his hand along her arm, keeping the atmosphere calm and relaxed, letting the moment unfold naturally. "I'm really close to losing it just sitting here watching her." Joan turned her head to look at Eric again, surprised he had joined her and Stephen's chat. In her dazed state, she had almost forgotten he was just a few feet away. Suddenly alarmed and feeling self-conscious about her posture, she quickly brought her knees together and placed her feet on the floor. Afraid that this might seem unfriendly, she smiled at Eric, silently thanking him for his kind words. Eric smiled back at Joan. "You looked amazing. I was really close to losing control just watching you." Biting her lip, Joan instinctively glanced at Eric's hand, taken aback by his size. Seeing her gaze, Stephen grinned and said, "He's got quite a presence, doesn't he?" Joan felt flustered, realizing she had been caught staring. Yeah, it is," she replied, trying to recover. Chuckling, Stephen noticed the curiosity on Joan's face. "Would you like to get a closer look?" he asked. Joan met Stephen's gaze and sensed he was serious. A rush of adrenaline made her heart race. Embarrassed by her body's reactions, she quickly replied, "No, I shouldn't do that." As time passed, Stephen continued to encourage her. "Are you sure? Just look. I bet you're curious about what it feels like. Eric wouldn't mind." Joan felt a mix of emotions, torn between curiosity and her more reserved upbringing. She found herself unable to respond. Finally, Stephen urged her, "Go for it. I know there's a part of you that wants to. It would really excite me to see you do that." After a brief pause, he added, "And Eric wouldn't mind. Just a little touch." Feeling her body tense with uncertainty, Joan turned to Eric for guidance, catching his encouraging response. "Absolutely!" Stephen glanced up at Joan and noticed the soft, flushed expression on her face. He felt a sense of pride, knowing she was completely relaxed and calm after everything that had just happened. As he sat back to take in the sight of her resting on the couch, he admired how peaceful she looked. Her chest rose and fell steadily as she took deep breaths, and her posture showed just how comfortable she was in the moment. He couldn't help but feel a wave of appreciation for the beauty and calm she radiated. While he was aware that later they might share more time together, his mind was currently occupied with other thoughts. Motivated by his next idea, Stephen stood up and then sat beside Joan on her right side. He gently began to trace his hand along her body, from her knee to her shoulder. Each touch seemed to bring him a sense of connection, especially when his hand passed over her chest. He enjoyed the simplicity of the moment and the quietness that followed. After a few minutes, Stephen glanced at his friend Eric, who was still sitting on Joan's other side. He had an idea and decided to share it aloud, his voice light and teasing. "You looked amazing just now, Joan. Did you enjoy it?" Joan, still basking in the peaceful feeling that followed, smiled lazily. She nodded and responded with a simple, "Yeah." Stephen, continuing to playfully ask, said, "Are you sure?" With a soft grin, Joan replied, "Yes, I'm sure." Stephen paused for a moment, then decided to surprise her with his next words. "What do you think, Eric? Do you think she's telling the truth?" Eric, amused by the question, chuckled lightly and replied, "From where I was sitting, it sure looked like she enjoyed herself. She looked amazing." The mood between them remained light, each of them enjoying the relaxed and easy atmosphere. As Stephen continued to gently run his fingers over Joan's skin, focusing on her reactions, he leaned in and whispered softly, "Does it excite you to be close to another man like this while someone else is touching you too?" Joan took a deep breath, shivering at his words. With her voice filled with emotion, she responded simply, "Yes." Eric, sensing the energy in the room, felt his own tension rise. He couldn't believe the situation he found himself in. When he first saw Joan, he thought she was way out of reach, assuming Stephen was just showing off. But now, as he sat next to her, with her hand resting gently on his arm, he could hardly believe his luck. Trying to keep his emotions in check, Eric spoke up, his voice strained with excitement. "You're amazing! Part of me doesn't want this to end because I feel like we could keep going, but—" Eric hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should say what was really on his mind. Finally, unable to hold back, he continued, "But I'd love to get to know you more, to explore and connect with you in other ways." Stephen, noticing the moment and wanting to keep the energy going, smiled and added playfully, "So, Eric, do you just want to get closer? Or is there something more you're hoping for?" Both Joan and Eric sighed at Stephen's words, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Joan's inner voice, however, urged her to slow down. Acting on this feeling, she gently pulled her hand away from Eric and said, "I'm not sure. I don't think I can take things any further." Stephen had expected her response, but before he could say anything, Eric quickly reassured her. "That's totally fine," he said with sincerity. "I'd love to, but I want you to feel comfortable. I don't want you to do anything you're not okay with." Joan looked into Eric's eyes and saw the honesty in his words. It helped her relax a little, feeling more at ease in the situation. A few moments later, as Joan saw Eric quietly watching her while still maintaining his calm demeanor, she felt flattered once more by the attention he was giving her. She knew that his actions were influenced by her presence, and the fact that he was so captivated by her made her feel a mix of emotions. Stephen, noticing her hesitation, gently asked, "Are you sure you don't want to do anything, Joan?" He placed his hand on her upper leg and slowly slid it down toward her inner thigh, softly encouraging her to relax. His gentle touch made Joan tense for a moment, but she didn't resist. Stephen continued, "Look at him." His voice was calm as he directed her attention to Eric. "Are you sure there's not a part of you that wonders what it would feel like to explore something new?" Joan trembled slightly, her mind racing. Stephen's words always seemed to carry a unique influence over her, one that made her question things she never would have considered before. She tried to resist the pull she felt, but struggled with the strong emotions inside her. "I shouldn't," she whispered. "I'm married. I shouldn't even be here like this." Despite her words, Stephen gently reassured her, "You should be here. This moment is exactly why you returned. There's a part of you that wants to push beyond the boundaries you've set for yourself." He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "I know part of why you came back was because of me, and I'm honored by that. But I also see that something deeper has been awakened in you." Joan remained quiet, processing everything Stephen said. His words, combined with the intensity of the moment, left her feeling both conflicted and curious about what she truly wanted. "I'm really feeling something," he said, pausing again as he gently touched Joan. "You need to pay attention to your feelings. And about your marriage, don't be concerned about your husband. He has told me he wants you to pursue your dreams and try new things. That shows how much he cares about you and wants you to be happy. So it's time to let go. Embrace the feelings inside you. If you want to have fun with Eric right now, then go ahead. I know both of us would love to see you enjoy that." Breathless and wrapped in her thoughts, Joan felt overwhelmed by the situation. She was torn as she replied, "I'm not sure. I don't know if I should take your advice." Being truthful and confused, she continued, "I don't know how I would feel about doing more than I already have. Even if I wanted to, I'm not sure how far I could go. That's part of the thrill. Not knowing what's next is what makes it exciting. Look at Eric. He's really interested in you. It's not just how great you look. It's also the surprise of what you might do that makes it thrilling for him. And I can see that it's exciting for you too." He paused for a moment, then added, "Remember, whatever you choose to do is just casual fun. You and your husband share something deeper, but with me and possibly others, it's just about enjoying the moment. You've mentioned this before." Noticing how much his words were affecting him, he finally said, "So, how far should you go? That's up to you. Maybe let Eric get to know you a bit with his hands, or share a kiss, or think about letting him be closer to you in a way that feels right." With a deep sigh at his suggestion, Joan felt a rush of excitement that made her heart race. Joan was breathless, trembling even more than before. She felt overwhelmed, unable to find the words she wanted to say, as if her voice had been taken away. Stephen, eager to see what Joan might decide, leaned closer to her and gently whispered, "It's okay. Let Eric be close to you. Let him show you how much he cares." His words were soft, but they pushed her closer to a choice, especially as he lightly touched her ear and continued to gently encourage her. Joan's thoughts raced as she struggled to find her footing. She could feel the tension growing within her, but no words came. She glanced at Eric, her eyes shifting between his face and the calm way he carried himself, unsure of how to respond. Eric, although feeling just as much tension as Stephen, was careful. He could see that Joan was uncertain, and he didn't want to push her too far. He stayed where he was, his eyes focused on her, watching her carefully to understand what she might need in that moment. His heart beat faster as he noticed her gaze lingering on him. Feeling more confident, Eric slowly moved forward, his hands gently reaching for Joan. He touched her lightly, his fingers tracing her stomach, her warmth making him pause. He marveled at her presence, moving with care, ensuring she remained comfortable as he touched her arms and shoulders. Each touch was slow, and every movement was thoughtful, as if he were checking to see if this was truly what she wanted. In time, Joan found herself lying back, more relaxed as Eric adjusted her position, moving with a gentle touch. He stayed focused, making sure that every action was mindful of her comfort, his attention fully on her. There was a softness to the way he interacted with her, and in that quiet moment, everything seemed to slow down as they shared a mutual understanding. A few moments later, Eric moved closer to Joan, carefully guiding himself as he touched her, his movements deliberate and focused. Joan, feeling his presence, was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions, caught between the intensity of the moment and the soft voice in her mind telling her to pause. Still, she found herself lost in the sensation, unable to pull away. As Eric touched her, Joan felt as though she were in a dream, letting him explore without protest. Despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her, she felt a strong pull towards the experience, her thoughts quieting as her body responded to the moment. Though a part of her mind questioned what was happening, the warmth and closeness of Eric's presence kept her still, unable to resist. When Eric spoke gently, asking her if he should continue, Joan hesitated only briefly. The voice of caution that had been loud moments before was now a distant echo. "No," she whispered shakily. "Just continue." Her body seemed to answer before her mind fully processed the decision. Eric, hearing her response, took a deep breath and moved carefully, his focus completely on ensuring that Joan was comfortable. There was a quietness in the room, a shared understanding as they both remained present in the moment. Feeling lightheaded, Eric placed his hand on Joan's hip to steady himself. Slowly, he began to move closer, his focus entirely on being careful and mindful of her reactions. As he adjusted, Joan gasped softly, her body responding to the new sensations. Joan found herself overwhelmed by the situation, her thoughts racing as she tried to process the intensity of the moment. The sense of vulnerability and closeness with someone new made her heart pound. She took deep breaths, allowing herself to adjust and focus on the physical connection, each moment building on the last. With every movement, she felt more aware of the situation, unsure of how she felt but unable to turn away. Stephen, watching closely, leaned forward and softly spoke to Joan. "You're doing great," he whispered. His words were meant to calm her, offering gentle support as she remained in the moment. Joan's mind drifted, focusing on the feeling of being connected, her body responding instinctively. As Stephen's hand rested on her shoulder, she felt a sense of comfort and reassurance. The room seemed quieter now, and Joan allowed herself to focus on the present, letting go of her earlier hesitation. Stephen, sensing her growing comfort, spoke again in a gentle tone. "Is everything okay? Do you feel all right?" Joan nodded, too focused to speak, but the small gesture was enough to show that she was comfortable and at ease. The atmosphere was calm and understanding, allowing her to feel grounded as the moment unfolded. As Stephen watched Joan and Eric together, he felt a mix of emotions, both admiration for Joan's courage to explore something new and a sense of satisfaction in knowing that he had played a role in helping her expand her experiences. A short time later, Stephen noticed Joan adjusting her position, pulling her knees back to allow more space between her legs. This subtle movement signaled her openness, and as he looked at her face, he saw how deeply she was immersed in the moment. Her expression showed nothing but intensity, her eyes glazed with focus. Trying to keep his composure, Stephen softly encouraged her. "Go ahead, Joan. Let go. I want to see you completely enjoy this." Joan responded with actions rather than words. She reached behind Eric's lower back, signaling her desires clearly through her movements. Her request was simple yet powerful. "Don't hold back." Feeling her invitation, Eric took a deep breath and focused. He embraced the moment, moving with more energy and intent, determined to match her pace. With each motion, he concentrated on staying present, ensuring he gave Joan the space she needed to fully embrace the experience. For Joan, the intensity grew quickly. The sensations filled her completely, making her lose track of everything else happening around her. Her focus was entirely on the feelings building inside, unaware that the room had grown quiet and all eyes were on her. Her body responded to each moment with every movement feeling more and more electric. Stephen remained close, his presence calming as he gently touched her. He let his hands trail across her skin, his movements deliberate yet soothing. When she opened her eyes briefly, she felt grounded by his touch, his steady hand helping her stay connected. As the moment built, both Joan and Eric moved in sync, completely immersed in the shared experience. Stephen and Eric were both focused on Joan, working in sync to bring her the ultimate sense of pleasure. The awareness of being in an intimate situation with both of them, while surrounded by strangers, left Joan overwhelmed, her emotions building quickly. The intense physical sensations and her heightened awareness led her to take a deep breath. With every muscle in her body tensing, she felt a wave of release as a powerful surge of euphoria washed over her. As Joan experienced the rush of her emotions, Eric remained attentive, adjusting to her needs. He moved in rhythm with her, ensuring that her experience was as fulfilling as possible. His movements became more deliberate, watching her reaction with care. Soon, as the moment reached its peak, he pulled back slightly, sensing that it was time to let her rest and catch her breath. Stephen, observing the shift, moved closer to Joan, taking the opportunity to gently lean in and kiss her. His words, filled with affection, were soft as he whispered, "You looked amazing." He embraced her gently, letting her relax while their closeness continued. Joan, still catching her breath, responded by pulling Stephen closer, their connection deepening as they kissed. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the shared moment between them. But soon, her attention was brought back to the present when Eric gently placed his hand on her shoulder, offering her comfort and support. As the room quieted, Stephen leaned back to watch, letting the moment settle. He smiled, savoring the shared connection and the calm that had settled over them all. As Stephen watched Eric's movements, his gaze remained focused on how Joan responded. She held her knees up close, clearly enjoying the moment, which made Stephen more aware of the atmosphere around them. He felt an instinctive pull but kept his distance, simply observing and staying composed for a moment. Eventually, Stephen leaned toward Joan and softly asked, "Is Eric making you feel good?" Joan, who had been lost in the sensations with her eyes closed, opened them when she heard Stephen's voice. She was surprised to see him sitting next to her, clearly caught up in the moment himself. She took a deep breath, biting her lip, trying to stay grounded as the intensity of the situation continued to grow. Stephen smiled and asked, "Do you want me to take over now?" Joan responded quietly, "Yeah." Though ready to join, Stephen paused and changed his mind. "I will, but first I want to watch you and Eric a little longer. I'd like to see you help him finish." Joan didn't reply right away, caught in the rush of emotions. Eric, clearly just as affected, spoke up with a grin. "It won't take long at this rate." Stephen turned back to Joan, looking her in the eyes, and asked, "Would that be okay? Do you want to help Eric?" Barely able to speak through the overwhelming sensation, Joan whispered, "Yes." Satisfied with her response, Stephen nodded at Eric, who stood and moved closer to Joan. He adjusted her gently, lifting her into a new position so she could feel more at ease. Joan felt a rush of excitement as Eric carefully guided her, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Everyone watching could feel the intensity of the moment as Eric prepared to continue, with a sense of shared experience surrounding them. Eric paused, just a few inches away from Joan, and asked softly, Are you ready?" Joan, overwhelmed by the moment and aware that everyone in the room was watching her, took a deep breath before replying, "Yeah." Feeling a rush of excitement himself, Eric gently tapped against Joan's body, the sounds in the room amplifying the intensity. "Go ahead," he encouraged her. "Show me you want this." Joan reached out and grasped Eric's hand, her thoughts racing. She hesitated for just a moment, surprised at how heavy the moment felt, before guiding him closer. As she did, she thought, "I can't believe this is happening." The intensity of the moment built as they moved closer, her body responding to the sensations. Eric, lost in the experience, moved in rhythm, feeling the connection grow stronger. He placed his hands gently on Joan, supporting her as they both became more immersed in the moment. His focus remained on her, and the room seemed to quiet around them. Joan, fully caught in the sensations, concentrated on her breathing, trying to stay grounded. A few minutes later, she glanced at Stephen, who was nearby, quietly encouraging her. The overwhelming feeling washed over her once more, leaving her breathless. For a few moments, the world around her blurred as she let go of everything but the present. As the intensity grew, Eric, noticing Joan's reaction, remained close, supporting her throughout. The shared moment, surrounded by quiet attention, left them both deeply connected in the experience as they continued together, fully present in the moment. As Joan kissed him back, Eric felt a sense of relief and excitement. The moment was overwhelming, and he couldn't hold back any longer. Breathless, he stopped and said, "I can't keep going. I'm about to lose control." Joan, caught up in the intensity of the moment, felt a brief conflict. She knew the risks, but couldn't deny the temptation of letting things continue. However, before she could say anything, she heard Stephen's voice. "Eric, pull back and finish as you like." Without hesitation, Eric moved away. He focused intently, taking a deep breath before letting go. He could feel the intensity as he reached the height of the moment, and in a few seconds it was over. The sensation was overwhelming for Joan, and as she processed everything, she felt a mix of relief and excitement. Joan remained still, feeling the warmth and closeness of the moment lingering. She was aware of everything that had happened, but found herself surprisingly calm. The experience, though unexpected and new, left her feeling a sense of freedom. It wasn't about being reckless, but about being present, about embracing the moment without judgment. Stephen, observing quietly from the side, watched with a mix of curiosity and admiration. He could see that Joan was lost in the experience, fully immersed in the moment, and he simply smiled to himself. There was no need for words now. The room was filled with an understanding silence, allowing everyone to catch their breath. Stephen looked into Joan's eyes and with a playful tone said, "That was incredible. You're amazing." He leaned in closer and whispered, "You know, anyone here would love to be with you. You have something special about you." He softly ran his hand over her stomach, lightly brushing against her, and kissed her gently. Then, pulling back for a moment, he added, "Everyone here is watching, and I know they all admire you. Would you want to share this moment with someone else? Another friend of mine, perhaps?" Joan's mind raced as she processed his words. "I can't believe he's asking me this," she thought. Her body was still filled with the rush of the moment, and part of her was tempted. But another voice inside urged her to pause, telling her that it might be too much. As Stephen's attention shifted back to her, the decision became even more complicated. Still lost in thought, Joan felt Stephen's lips on her again, his playful teasing pulling her deeper into the moment. When he asked her once more, "Do you want someone else to join us?" Joan felt her inner conflict reach its peak. The idea was exciting, but something inside held her back. Finally, she shook her head, saying, "No, not now. I only want you." Her voice was filled with certainty, and her eyes met his with a look of pure focus. Stephen, although slightly disappointed at not watching her with someone else, was still thrilled by her response. With a grin, he teased her. "What was that? What do you want?" Joan, feeling bold, surprised herself with her response. "I want you." Stephen smiled wider. "Are you sure?" Joan nodded. "Yes." And with that, the two remained close, fully engaged in their connection, letting the moment carry them forward. Stephen, full of anticipation, asked softly, "How do you want this, Joan?" Joan, caught up in the moment, replied with passion, I don't care. I just want you close. I want to feel you with me. Just then, a towel appeared at Joan's side, tossed over by Eric, who had quietly moved away to clean up. Joan reached for it, ready to use it, but Stephen suddenly had a different idea. He leaned in and with a slightly trembling voice said, "Wait, this moment seeing you like this is something I can't get out of my head. Please don't clean up yet. I want to be close to you just as you are." Joan paused, taking in Stephen's words. She knew what he meant and after a brief moment of thought, decided to go along with the feeling of freedom she had been exploring. With a quiet sigh, she tossed the towel aside. Stephen watched as the towel hit the floor, feeling the energy between them grow stronger. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he prepared to move closer to Joan. His thoughts were completely focused on the moment, on the connection they shared. As he moved closer, everything else in the room seemed to fade. Stephen was lost in the feeling, the intensity between them, and Joan responded in kind. The shared experience of the night brought them to a place where words no longer mattered, only the presence of each other. Stephen was completely captivated by the moment. As he watched Joan, the connection between them deepened, and his focus on her intensified. Their eyes locked, and he could see the deep sense of desire and contentment on her face, which fueled his passion even more. For Joan, feeling Stephen close again was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She longed to express how good it felt, but the presence of others made her hesitate. Instead, she communicated through her actions, wrapping her arms around him and holding him tightly. She allowed herself to fully embrace the moment, relishing the closeness and the intensity of the connection they shared. She could no longer hold back and let out a soft cry of joy. Stephen, equally drawn into the moment, leaned in and kissed her deeply, savoring every second. His mind was fully focused on her and the connection they had. After a brief pause, he whispered to her, "You're amazing. I want everyone to see how beautiful you are." Feeling inspired by the shared energy between them, Stephen moved away slightly, lifting Joan effortlessly so that she was more comfortable. He placed her on the couch, giving them both a moment to catch their breath. They were fully present, allowing the connection and the shared experience to guide them forward. Stephen positioned himself comfortably behind Joan, gently turning her to lie in a spooning position on the couch. As he adjusted her, he noticed his friends in the room watching with fascination, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. A grin spread across his face when he noticed their reactions, and he whispered softly in Joan's ear, "Do you see them watching, sweetie? Do you see how captivated they are?" Joan, although aware that she had already been seen by everyone in the room, suddenly felt more vulnerable as Stephen shifted her position and lifted her leg. The cool air against her skin heightened her unease, and the intensity of the situation began to grow. When she turned her gaze towards the others, she gasped, realizing that the two couples who had been preoccupied earlier were now focused entirely on her and Stephen. One couple, sitting side by side, were watching while both engaged in their own intimate actions, clearly enjoying the scene before them. The other couple sat together, but what caught Joan's eye was the way the woman was actively involved with two different men, one of whom Joan recognized from earlier. As Joan absorbed the unexpected scene, she whispered, "Oh my God." Her breath quickened when she felt Stephen's movements as he carefully pulled her closer. A moment later, she gasped again as he gently but purposefully pressed forward, causing a wave of sensations to wash over her. Stephen, feeling the connection deepening between them, spoke softly again. "Do you see them? They're mesmerized." His words lingered as they both shared the moment, aware of the eyes on them, but lost in their own world. "They can't take their eyes off you," Stephen whispered softly, gripping Joan's thigh a little more firmly, pulling her leg closer to her body. Admiring her grace, he leaned down briefly to nibble on her ear, continuing, "You're completely captivating them. I bet every single one of them is wishing they could be where I am right now." Joan remained silent, deeply affected by his words. Her focus shifted entirely to the strangers just a few feet away, all watching her closely while they enjoyed their own moments, whether with themselves or their partners. The moment felt more intense as Stephen held her firmly, his movements steady and deliberate. His presence, combined with the atmosphere, pushed her senses to a new height. She gasped softly as Stephen's hand slid gently over her, brushing against her body in a way that made the moment even more charged. Moments later, Joan felt her breath catch as Stephen's fingers found the right spot. She clutched the couch tightly, feeling herself being pulled deeper into the experience. Unable to stop herself, she whispered, "Please, don't stop!" Stephen responded immediately, his pace increasing as he held her closer. His focus sharpened as he pushed harder, determined to match her intensity. Sweat formed on his brow as the effort grew, and he leaned in further, whispering, "Let go, just like before." Joan's body trembled as she felt another wave of release wash over her. Her vision blurred as she held on tightly, her grip on the couch strengthening as the intensity built. Lost in the sensation, she felt like she might lose herself completely, unable to distinguish the boundaries between her and the moment. Stephen, feeling her respond, slowed down to let the moment last a little longer, catching his breath as he marveled at the way the room seemed to fall in sync with them. Smiling softly, he whispered again, "You did it, you're amazing." "I told you someone would be amazed just by watching you," Stephen said, catching his breath as excitement filled his voice. "You're that captivating, Joan. Everyone here sees it, and I do too. You're incredible, like a goddess. That's why you should consider sharing this moment with someone else. You're a gift." Joan, feeling exhausted after her fourth intense experience of the night, found herself surprisingly still craving more. Each wave of pleasure seemed to grow stronger, pulling her deeper into a strange need. "What's happening to me?" she thought, confused yet drawn to the idea of wanting more, even though a part of her felt guilty for it. The guilt came, but it was quickly overwhelmed by a sense of desire. As these thoughts swirled in her mind, Stephen pulled away from her, letting his fingers glide teasingly along her legs. After a moment, he turned her onto her back and held her closely, kissing her neck and gently teasing her ear. Joan sighed, feeling the warmth of his touch. But as Stephen sat up, looking at her with admiration, his next words surprised her. "Would you like that, Joan? Would you want someone else to join us?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Though she had sensed that Stephen might ask something like this, Joan felt a rush of emotions. She breathed deeply, recovering from her recent intense feelings, but struggled to find the right words to answer him. Silence filled the space as she tried to gather her thoughts. Stephen, reading her hesitation, leaned closer and began to tease her further. His mouth brushed against her skin, and after a pause, he continued, "I can see it in your eyes. You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Joan, though still filled with lingering desire, shook her head. Despite the temptation, doubts were surfacing, and the situation was starting to feel overwhelming. Seeing the hesitation on her face, Stephen sensed it but pushed gently. "I know you're curious." But in that moment, Joan wasn't sure anymore. The situation had reached a tipping point, and she found herself pulling back, unsure if she could go any further. "I'm really feeling it." After brushing his lips softly against her skin, he noticed her reaction and said, "You want to feel a connection with someone new? Experience their touch and share a moment that excites you." Joan listened to his words, and her doubts started to fade as she felt a longing for closeness and affection. Yet she hesitated and said, "I don't know. I've done so much already. I'm not sure if I should go any further." Moving his hand gently up her side, he reached her shoulder and held on with a warm touch. He leaned in closer and whispered, "Yes, you should." He could tell he was pushing the boundaries of her comfort when she wrapped her arms around him tightly. He continued, "I think you should let someone else make you feel good again. And then, when you're done, you can enjoy making someone else happy too." After a short pause, he added, "Wouldn't you like that? Wouldn't you like to connect with someone else?" Feeling a mix of emotions from his words and her own desires, Joan reached out and held him close. She really wanted to feel that warmth again, showing it by trying to bring him closer. But she sensed he was holding back when he said to her, "Oh, I want to be close to you too. I want you to help me feel good like last time. But first, I really want to see you enjoy yourself one more time before the night ends." Looking into her eyes, Stephen teasingly brushed against her, captivated by their shared moment. He encouraged her, saying, "Come on, let yourself enjoy this." Surprised at how quickly her feelings had grown, she realized she was ready for more when she told Stephen eagerly, "Okay, I'll do it. Help me find someone." Without wasting a moment, Stephen leaned in and kissed her passionately, adjusting their positions so they could sit comfortably together. Breaking away from their kiss, Stephen was taken by surprise when Joan reached out to hold his hand, guiding him with a focused intent. Despite the unexpected move, Stephen composed himself and gently pulled her down beside him, positioning her so she could sit comfortably on her knees. He then lay back, guiding her hands to hold on to him as she straddled his waist. Pulling her in for another kiss, he softly brushed his fingers through her hair and turned her head to kiss her neck and ear. As he did so, Stephen glanced over to his friend Daryl, sitting on the other side of the room. Daryl had been quietly observing, watching his friend Stephen and feeling intrigued by the scene unfolding before him. However, his attention was still focused on the woman sitting beside him, and he continued to gently run his fingers along her hand. When he saw Stephen's look, Daryl recognized it as an invitation. But respectful of the situation, he leaned in toward the woman next to him and asked softly, "Would you mind if I joined Stephen and his friend for a moment? I promise I'll make it up to you later." Although the woman beside Daryl seemed reluctant, she smiled and said, "Only if you promise you'll come back and spend some time with me later on." Daryl grinned at her words, feeling the sense of adventure in the air. He stood up and walked over to Stephen and Joan, catching Stephen's gaze and giving him a nod of understanding. Without hesitation, Daryl knelt down beside them, offering his presence quietly and respectfully. As Joan felt someone touch her from behind, she froze for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Curiosity got the best of her, and when she turned around, she was surprised to see the man she had noticed earlier, Daryl, the man Stephen had spoken to. Feeling the unexpected presence, her heart raced, and her mind struggled to process what was happening. Stephen leaned closer to Joan and whispered in her ear, "Are you okay? Would you like to experience something new?" Joan's eyes met Stephen's briefly, the uncertainty and excitement swirling inside her. Her thoughts were spinning, but the intensity of the moment made it hard to focus. Slowly, she turned back to Daryl, feeling unsure yet intrigued by this new experience. Stephen, always in control of the moment, spoke clearly. "Daryl, this is Joan. She's curious about something new, and I think you can help her." Daryl, understanding the situation, smiled and nodded. He approached with a respectful air, making sure Joan was comfortable. There was no rush, just a sense of exploring something different. Joan, still processing everything, allowed herself to relax, realizing that the moment was about her feeling free and exploring in a safe space. Daryl and Stephen exchanged knowing glances, each understanding that they needed to ensure Joan felt safe and comfortable. And so they all continued, moving forward together, but with clear boundaries and a respectful understanding of what was unfolding. The moment remained a subtle exploration, with no pressure or expectation, and Joan felt herself becoming more attuned to her emotions and desires, all while feeling completely in control. Daryl, focused on the moment, felt his body tense up as he moved more intensely, matching Joan's pace as she braced herself and pushed back against him. He felt an overwhelming energy as he continued, sensing Joan's excitement building. His movements became faster and more determined, and Joan responded by pushing herself further into the rhythm. Suddenly, as Joan reached a powerful climax, her body trembled, and she felt a wave of intense pleasure sweep over her. The feeling was overwhelming, leaving her breathless, her mind briefly going blank from the sheer force of the sensation. She could feel Daryl pressing against her, his movements synchronized with hers, creating a heightened intensity. As time passed, Daryl adjusted his pace, allowing both of them to experience the connection between them. The moment, however, was interrupted when his wife approached with a playful smirk. She gently ran her fingers through Joan's hair and teased, "Are you having fun with my husband?" Joan, startled by the unexpected appearance of another person, quickly turned her head. She recognized the woman from earlier and felt a mix of surprise and awkwardness, but she couldn't deny the rush of emotions still coursing through her. The woman's playful demeanor eased the tension, allowing the atmosphere to remain light, even as Daryl maintained his steady movements. Despite the unexpected interaction, the moment continued with a sense of shared enjoyment between everyone involved, leaving Joan to process the unusual but intense experience. Joan was relieved when the woman gently smiled and said, "He knows how to make you feel good, doesn't he?" Out of breath and exhausted, Joan managed a simple, "Yes." The woman smiled warmly, her eyes filled with understanding. She reached out and softly caressed Joan's face, the tender gesture making Joan's heart race. Then, turning to her husband, the woman asked playfully, "So, do you want her to finish things for you, or would you rather I do it?" Joan listened quietly, feeling the tension in the air as the couple spoke. Daryl, still focused on Joan, responded, "That's a hard choice. She feels amazing." He paused for a moment before adding, "But what do you want, Jessica?" Jessica grinned, clearly excited as she shared what had happened earlier. "Well, when I stepped away earlier, David pulled me aside. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to be alone with me," she said with a wink. "Let's just say he did a good job and I let him have his fun." The mention of this seemed to spark something in Daryl, and without hesitation he withdrew from Joan. He leaned down, kissed her softly, and whispered, "You were amazing, Joan. Thank you. But now I need some time with my wife." Without another word, Daryl gently helped his wife into a more comfortable position on the couch nearby. His focus shifted to her, leaving Joan with a sense of both relief and curiosity. The connection between the couple was clear, and Joan quietly observed as Daryl turned his attention fully to Jessica, showing their bond in that shared moment. Daryl and Jessica shared a deeply connected moment, their closeness evident as they embraced. Joan, lying beside Stephen, observed their tender exchange with quiet admiration, taking in the emotions they conveyed to one another. Stephen turned to Joan and whispered, "It's something special, isn't it?" His words matched the peaceful atmosphere surrounding them. Joan nodded in agreement, her smile revealing her appreciation for the intimacy shared between the couple. Stephen, sensing her mood, moved beside her with a gentle touch. The room was filled with a quiet reverence, the connection between everyone palpable. Each couple was wrapped in their own world, yet part of a larger experience, embracing the moment in their own way. As the evening unfolded, the atmosphere softened, and the couples continued to enjoy the warmth and togetherness of the night. Stephen and Joan were locked in an intense moment, their movements slowing as the room filled with quiet tension. Stephen, admiring the passion in Joan's eyes, felt the weight of the moment as he looked at her. With a deep breath, he whispered, "You make everything feel so perfect." His words were filled with a mixture of affection and desire. Joan, feeling a sense of power in the situation, smiled softly. She knew that they had both reached the edge of their connection for the night, and the feeling of closeness made her heart race. With a steady voice, she replied, "I want you to feel as good as you've made me." Stephen, hearing her words, could feel his focus narrowing. He had been so immersed in the heat of the moment that now, hearing Joan's approval, he felt like everything around them had fallen away. All that mattered was the connection between them. His movements became more deliberate, and soon both of them were overcome with a shared sense of relief and release, the intensity of the night winding down. Joan sighed softly, feeling the warmth of the shared experience. The room seemed quieter now, as if the world had softened around them, and the moment felt more like a gentle pause than an ending. Stephen held her close for a little longer, and they shared a few more quiet moments before resting together in comfortable silence. Stephen pulled away from Joan and guided her gently to kneel before him. Overcome with emotion, he felt an intense connection between them. He looked down, appreciating her presence as she settled on her knees in front of him. He felt a powerful surge of energy, the moment carrying an unspoken bond between them. Joan, feeling equally engaged, focused on Stephen, sensing his excitement. The air between them was thick with unspoken understanding, and she supported herself by resting her hands on his legs, taking in the moment without a second thought. As they both breathed deeply, Stephen felt a wave of relief wash over him, appreciating the connection they had just shared. He felt lightheaded from the intensity, but grateful for the closeness between them. Joan, still filled with energy, laughed softly, her mind swirling with a mix of emotions. There was a sense of liberation in her, and she welcomed the moment with an open heart. As she composed herself, she suddenly felt someone move near her, and in a blink, she was placed in a sitting position on the couch. Startled, she felt alarmed, her instincts immediately causing her to speak up. "No! Please, not right now," Joan managed to say. But before she could continue, a wave of comfort and relief washed over her as she heard a familiar voice. "You're the most amazing, beautiful woman I know." She quickly wiped her eyes clear and smiled warmly when she saw her husband, Brent, who had gently wrapped her in his embrace. She felt a sense of peace and joy as he held her close, his familiar presence bringing comfort. As they held each other, it struck her that the evening had been filled with so many unexpected moments. As they locked eyes, Joan whispered, "I love you, baby." She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, feeling the connection between them deepen. Brent, equally moved, responded, "I'll always be yours, Joan." His words carried the same intensity of the bond they shared. They stayed close, breathing in the moment, cherishing their love and the unique experience of the night. They exchanged soft words of love and understanding, knowing that their connection had been strengthened. Suddenly, soft applause filled the room, making them laugh lightly with a touch of embarrassment. Stephen smiled at them and said, "You two are amazing." After a pause, he added with a grin, "But the night's not over just yet. How about we take a break and freshen up before round 2? Joan and Brent shared a knowing smile, ready to enjoy the rest of the evening hand in hand. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to Infidelity Plus to stay updated with more captivating tales of infidelity and payback. Turn on notifications so you're the first to see our latest content.